Essentially, what happened was, to give you the background, then we'll bring in CBSN tech reporter Dan Patterson. Facebook removed Donald Trump from both Instagram and Facebook after a couple of posts. The Instagram post was the video that you may or may not have seen where he says, "I know your pain, I know you're hurt, we had an election stolen from us, it was a landslide election." He goes on. For Facebook, there was a posting, where he said, "These are the things that happen, these are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is unceremoniously and viciously stripped away." So you get the sense. So for those two reasons, they remove those posts, which is typically what Facebook does when they don't agree, when they think a post is problematic. But then they also imposed something else, a ban on Donald Trump using their platforms, and it was kind of like an open-ended ban. And that's what the Oversight Board had to consider, whether or not it was that was an appropriate punishment. So let's bring in CBSN tech reporter Dan Patterson, because now we've gotten an opportunity to listen to the Oversight Board's reasoning and also look at the decision that they wrote on their website, and we see that it's multifaceted. They agreed, yes, Facebook was correct in pulling down those posts, but then this additional punishment, they said, Facebook, you got to take a second look at this. Dan, can you talk about the series of recommendations that the board issued?
You know, we can kind of sum this up with what you said a moment ago, that Facebook, at least according to the Oversight Board, did not do enough to articulate the terms of the suspension. Michael McConnell, who is the board chair, said that Facebook's justification to remove the content was in violation of its own rules, and that was in large part because they didn't say how long, what the specific terms of the ban were. And that's really important because it is, although they did address the content and the urgency of harmful content, it allows them to say this was about a particular case of function, the articulation of these rules, not necessarily the content, or not at least wholly the content.
So, Dan, let me play a clip from the board's ruling.
The board is holding today that Facebook's treatment of Mr. Trump's future posting privileges did not meet these standards and cannot continue without a sober and comprehensive review, applying the same rules to Mr. Trump, neither better nor worse, as applied to everyone else. We are giving Facebook 6 months to conduct this review, at which point the company must make a definite and clear determination based on the severity of the conduct and the danger of future harm.
So that was from the Oversight Board. Let's throw up the Facebook statement that they just released, Dan, while we were listening to that conference call, which was being held by the Oversight Board for reporters. It says, in part, while the board has not required Facebook to immediately restore Mr. Trump's accounts, it does not specify the appropriate duration of the penalty. Instead, the board criticized the open-ended nature of the suspension, calling it an indeterminate and standardless penalty, and insisted we review our response. We will now consider the board's decision and determine an action that is clear and proportionate. In the meantime, Mr. Trump's accounts remain suspended. So what Facebook seems to be saying is they are just weighing in, the board, on the indeterminate nature of the suspension, not the reasons why Facebook chose to suspend former President Trump.
Yeah, this allows both organizations to get around this weighty term of free speech, or what is speech. It allows them to focus on the functions, the mechanics of the site and Facebook's labeling and then banning of content. The function of that, not necessarily the content itself. And I think that if and when we start talking about the content itself, we also have to have this conversation, or at least there is kind of this inevitability of a dovetailed conversation about what is free speech. And I think it's in everybody's interest to stay away from defining what free speech is. And Facebook, like we've talked about all morning, lets the Oversight Board make kind of these finely tuned decisions about how content is or how Facebook's behavior on the site is or was not appropriate. That also lets them avoid making broad changes to the site. They can say this is the particular instance in which we didn't apply our own standards, or we weren't clear about the duration of the ban, instead of saying this is something that then has to be applied to everyone and require huge changes in the site.
It almost seems, though, a little bit when I look at the recommendations, if I'm sort of reading them correctly, that the board is also suggesting, well, you have to create standards. Like, you have to create standards for a highly influential political figure. Right now, the way the guidelines are written out, the President of the United States should be treated the same way any one of us would be treated. And then Vlad and I put up an offensive post that violates the community guidelines, it gets pulled down, but we don't get pulled down. So it sounded like the board is essentially saying, come back in 6 months with some clear-cut guidelines and punishments, and how you're going to also manage your own role, Facebook, in amplifying these voices, particularly when the voices are of a certain amount of newsworthiness. It's a political figure, so you can't just sort of ignore it, and then come back and see us. So in 6 months, we might be here again.
Yeah, that ambiguity is what the Oversight Board was addressing. And in many ways, this is what you and I might be frustrated about, or anybody who has used Facebook or social media and received a content strike or a labeling of content. There is this feeling of, hey, this was fairly arbitrary. I didn't really understand what the rules are or what the penalty was. And the Oversight Board is kind of saying the same thing here, that you may or may not have been okay in taking this content down, but because you didn't enumerate or specify the terms, it invalidates your actions.
Fascinating. We should also point out, Anne-Marie, we did an interview yesterday, didn't we, with the one of the members of the quote-unquote the real Facebook Oversight Committee, which is a completely independent organization, right? It's interesting that they've also put out a statement, and I'll just read in part what it says, and it's something that we've talked about. So this is one of the critics of the actual Oversight Board, and it just says, today's decision shows that the Facebook Oversight Board experiment has failed. This verdict is a desperate attempt to have it both ways. Dan, you pointed out something similar. I'm quoting here now, upholding the quote-unquote ban of Donald Trump without actually banning him, while punting any real decisions back to Facebook. It goes on to say this is a Facebook-funded, Facebook-appointed body that has no legitimacy to make real decisions. Facebook's attempt to divert attention from its fundamental failure to take responsibility for what's on its own platform has itself failed. So that's the statement from the real Oversight Board. That's what they call themselves, the real Facebook Oversight Board.
They are completely independent and they have no connection to Facebook. They're just sort of an independent board critiquing the board's critiquing. But I do see the validity in that statement. And Dan, I don't know if you agree that, and I said this kind of earlier, that part of the problem with this board is it almost seems like Facebook sort of threw it together before it was fully baked. And they've determined that typically all the board does is say thumbs up or thumbs down on a post coming down or going back up. And that's it. They don't decide to take down whole pages or anything. As I understand it, Dan, it's a 20-person board, but the final plan is to have 40 people on the board and expand its ability, what it can do in regards to assessing Facebook's decisions. But right now, it's kind of only in its beginning stages, and it's making some pretty high-profile decisions.
Yeah, you both allude to the meta conversation around the Oversight Board and Facebook, and we don't ever want to get too far down Twitter rabbit holes or into conspiracy theories, but the fact is the Oversight Board's relationship with Facebook has been hotly debated by communication and disinformation experts for a long time, and there does appear to be this relationship between the two that is kind of hard to ignore. Not only the financing, not only the fact that the web hosting is shared, but there are these kind of soft instructions given to board members. And although Facebook and the Oversight Board like to compare this to a Supreme Court, and in many ways we do watch the decisions that the Oversight Board makes kind of like the Supreme Court, they are malleable, like you alluded to, Anne-Marie. They will likely grow. Their rules and bylaws can change. And although Facebook says we have to abide by what the board says, there's a lot of room for Facebook to interpret what the board says. So that is very distinct and separate from how our own Supreme Court operates, even though both companies, both organizations have made that connection time and time again.
All right, Dan, this conversation is not going away at the very least because, as Anne-Marie points out, we may be back here again in 6 months. Thank you, as always, my friend. We appreciate it.
Great to see you.